Another thing that's going to happen is following the lead of African Americans who had had remarkable success fighting for equality, we're going to see other groups rise up and demand their own equality. African Americans, Hispanics, gays, and others will have their own civil rights movements. The term Native American is actually coined at this during this time because they're not Indians. Columbus had inappropriately named them Indians, thinking he was in India. He's in the West Indies. He thought he was in the East Indies, but he wasn't. They're not Indians. They're Native Americans. So stop it. They had historically been the worst off group in the Americas. Well, after the white man showed up, they were the worst off group in America. And they had been largely ignored by government policy. In fact, they had been more than ignored. They had been largely persecuted. In 1953, termination laws ended the reservation system and any sort of separate status for Native Americans. And this is going to be another attempt at assimilation. The conformity of the 50s will demand that we assimilate the natives. The Native Americans fought back so hard they got the policy suspended 5 years later in 1958. And the Democrats managed to push through a bill restoring tribal sovereignty, some control of their own lands to the Native Americans. If you don't know what tribal sovereignty is, Google Bush tribal sovereignty. And began to funnel federal dollars to the tribes to try to help them out. The Native American population begins to grow rapidly again and gets up to about 800,000. So this is a relatively small group, but they're a small group that demands equality. By 1961, more than 400 Native Americans go to Chicago, and they declare their right to self-determination and their right to preserve their culture. They call for tribal unity, all the tribes coming together to fight for Native American rights. And by 1968, we see the development of the American Indian Movement. This is a militant group demanding equality for Native Americans. In 1968 as well, the Indian Civil Rights Act is passed, and it extends the protections in the Bill of Rights to the Native Americans and recognizes the legitimacy of tribal laws. In Washington, Native Americans clash with the government over fishing rights. And then spectacularly, Native Americans will occupy the abandoned prison on Alcatraz off the coast of San Francisco. And when the government says, "Why do you think this is your land?" they said, "Well, we found it. We just showed up and took it." Their point being, this is how the white people got on the land from them, so they're just going to go claim now it's all theirs. What's the difference? They were obviously trying to make a point. Nixon promised to expand their rights and provide more federal aid, but he doesn't do much. And the Lakota occupy the Bureau of Indian Affairs in 1972 for 6 days. They take over the building. In 1973, the American Indian Movement, AIM, seizes Wounded Knee. This, of course, had been where perhaps the most shameful massacre of the Indian Wars had taken place. And, of course, is a great symbol for the Native Americans. And they occupy Wounded Knee for 2 months with the federal government demanding that they leave. They're armed, and they demand the old treaties be honored, but they really win few concessions. There's gunfights, as you see the car shot up. And Leonard Peltier is accused of shooting some federal law enforcement officers. And will be on the run for decades from federal authorities. But the Native Americans weren't alone. Hispanics are also fighting for their own rights. They're the fastest growing group in the United States. They don't really begin coming over in significant numbers until World War II. But of course, they are relatively unlikely to immigrate back. Los Angeles has more Mexicans in it than any other city in the world except for Mexico City. And this gives you a sense of the presence of Mexicans here in America. By 1960, there's 3 million Hispanic Americans. By 1970, there's 9 million. By 2010, there's 35 million. So you see this tremendous trajectory of growth. A third of all immigrants post-1960s are Hispanic. And that only counts the illegal immigrants. You have another 7 to 12 million people who come here without permission. Puerto Ricans, who are also Hispanic, of course, but different, come to the East Coast, and we see New York develop a massive population of Puerto Rican Americans. Cubans fleeing the communist regime in Cuba flee to Florida. Early Cubans, by the way, were able to come in and be assimilated and seen as kind of great victims. We had a lot of sympathy for them. But later generations of Cubans would not be treated as well. And Cubans who came in the 60s and maybe 70s tend to be middle class, while those who came in the 80s and beyond tend to stay poor. By the 1980s, we also see significant immigration from Central America and the Caribbean, at least in part because of the Cold War expands that area and war begins to break out in places like Nicaragua and El Salvador. Native Americans do organize, and they celebrate their heritage, and they begin to demand a voice, particularly in local government. The Native Americans tend to focus on trying to win like city council seats and mayorships and things like that. They form the group La Raza Unida as a political wing to try to advance political power for Hispanics. And Cesar Chavez will become a hero to many Hispanic Americans and supporters of Hispanics by organizing the United Farm Workers and creating a massive union. And if you lived back then, you might remember bumper stickers saying things like "No lettuce" or "No grapes." These were boycotts organized by Chavez's group to try to improve the economic standing of the migrant farm worker. But of course, Hispanics will continue to lag behind, both in political power and in income. Here's a little quote from Cesar Chavez, if you want to pause it and read this. A final group our third group I want to talk about here, it's not the last one, is gays. This is the most controversial of the group because I think many Americans at the time did not accept the idea that people were born gay. A lot of people saw this as a lifestyle choice, and so somebody might say, well, if you're born Hispanic or you're born Native American or you're born black, I can get behind that because that's not your fault, but you chose to be gay. I'm certainly not saying that's how I feel, but that was the attitude throughout a lot of the 60s, 70s, and really in many places to today. We trace the gay liberation movement back to one particular night in New York City in an area of town called Stonewall. The cops, when for whatever reason they didn't have anything better to do or they wanted to get their arrest quotas up, would occasionally just go raid gay bars and just start arresting anybody who was in a gay bar because it was illegal to do. It wasn't illegal to be gay, but it was illegal to do gay things. And one night, and we don't really know why, or I don't know why, maybe you do, the cops go into a bar in this gay part of New York City, and they begin arresting these guys like they had been doing for years. And the gay guys have had enough, and they begin to fight back, and a riot breaks out right there in the middle of this nightclub district. And we mark this as the beginning of gays kind of fighting back and demanding their rights. The Gay Liberation Front is organized in New York, and the media begins covering gays, and there's this great debate. Is this a legitimate civil rights group, or is this a lifestyle choice that shouldn't be protected? There's a lot of talk and a lot of actual going on of coming out, of people coming out and admitting to their friends, or I shouldn't say admitting, that's the wrong word, explaining to their friends and families that they are in fact gay. By the 1980s, you begin to be shunned, not for being gay so much, but we begin to see people shunned for being anti-gay bigots. In a similar situation we saw with racism, it goes from being the oppressed group being looked down upon to the oppressing group looked down upon as inappropriate. Of course, we're going to get into a little bit later struggles that the gay community has. For example, AIDS, which was seen by so many people, unfortunately, as a plague sent by God or something to punish gay people. But we also see triumphs. We see gay officials elected. We see Harvey Milk, who becomes a city councilman in San Francisco. Tragically, though, he's shot by Dan White, another city councilman who didn't like gay people and didn't like Harvey Milk in particular. We also see things like Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And, of course, the recent struggle, as I make these videos, for marriage equality for gay folks. Here's a great quote. We'll do this in my class if you're in my class, but if we're not, I really highly recommend you read this. This is powerful stuff from Michael Fader, who was one of the gay guys who participated in the Stonewall riots.